This is just a brief handout of extra information that was too much to put on the presentation. Shall I just start?
Yes.
Okay, so my presentation is on women and education in the 19th century. By the 19th century, the cry for education for Victorian women was becoming more and more desperate. For many women, the opportunity for education would mean the eradication of day-to-day idleness and would allow them the ability to push for further rights and equality, which would hopefully remove the inherent patriarchy that dominates everyday society. There was fierce opposition, however, in terms of education and advancement. In terms of religious disputes, Christian doctrine was interpreted by many as proof of women's inferiority to men, and that God willed it that men would be superior. In terms of social disputes, many said that women would be unprepared for marriage because they would be preoccupied with education. In terms of economic disputes, men believed that women would take up the jobs and that there wouldn't be any for them. And medical evidence was even released to suggest that if women would become too educated, they would get fever of the brain, develop male characteristics, and would become sterile. This here is an image that was drawn by George Cruikshank in 1847, and basically describes what men believed would happen to the home if women were to become educated. So as you see, the house is a mess, the children have been left unattended, and the man's having to look after the baby. For women of the 19th century, education was somewhat provided. Upper-class ladies would receive tutelage at home from governesses. However, this education was strictly what a man felt it was important for a woman to know. For instance, they would have been taught needlework, cooking, cleaning, basically how to be a good woman. Despite an alteration in the education system with the Education Acts of 1817 and 1876, schooling was not made compulsory until 1880, and women were still taught these menial subjects. This is a quote from Jane Austen's Mansfield Park, and somewhat describes what women were supposed to learn. Such are the counsels by which Mrs. Norris assisted to form her nieces' minds, and it is not very wonderful that with all their promising talents and early information, they should be entirely deficient in the less common acquirements of self-knowledge, generosity, and humility. In everything but disposition, they were admirably taught. Sir Thomas did not know what was wanting, because, though a truly anxious father, he was not outwardly affectionate, and the reserve of his manner repressed all the flow of her spirits before him. To the education of her daughters, Lady Bertram paid not the smallest attention. I also thought this was quite interesting to see that women of a more mature status weren't as interested in education as the young women were, as they were versed in traditional ideals and had themselves fulfilled the traditional roles of women. This is a quote from the Saturday Review, written in 1867, and talks about the general woman in terms of a man. She thinks of nothing except her private affairs. She is indifferent to politics, to literature, in a word, to anything that requires thought. She reads novels of a kind because novels are all about love, and love had once something to do with marriage, her own peculiar and absorbing business. Beyond this, her mind does not stir. So obviously this is what man believes occupied the minds of women, and in many cases the men believed they were protecting women from failure because they weren't capable. Okay. This is a poem from the Nelson Evening Mail, and describes what women thought they would achieve in the future. I'll just read the first stanza. The women of the future shall be deeply read, that's certain, with all the education gained at Newnham or at Girton. Shall puzzle men in algebra with horrible quadratics, dynamics and the mysteries of higher mathematics. Or she turns to classics, tomes of literary Roma, shall give you bits of Horace or sonorous rhymes from Homer. After intense lobbying from educational pioneers Emily Davies and Barbara Beauchamp, colleges began to be open in the 19th century for women to become educated. And that's just a brief list of those. Okay, on to education and Villette. I had a brief look at John Hodge's essay, Villette's Compulsory Education, and he states that Villette shows us how to use the condition as a source of intellectual growth and expression. Melancholic obsession had been framed in terms of educational development throughout Villette. So, for instance, Polly learns to dress herself as a preemptive strike against the melancholy she would surely feel when Harriet should leave her. And she relates this to the story of Jacob and Joseph, and proves herself a ready scholar, and actually relates her own feelings towards that of the story of Jacob and Joseph. Hodge claims that becoming educated is for Polly to negotiate melancholic narratives of loss. So basically, Polly relates sadness to education. Lucy equates these two things when she confesses to Paul, you compel me to feel very profoundly that learning is not happiness. So here Lucy is saying, although she does not enjoy the tutorials, she appreciates their effectiveness and their importance of her getting an education. Lucy goes on to discuss Paul's teaching methods and how they make her feel. When Paul sneered at me, I wanted to possess the noble heart of the science more fully. His injustice stirred in me ambitious wishes. It imagined a strong stimulus. It gave wings to aspiration. Now, I found this quite ironic because her own teaching methods are somewhat similar, despite the fact that she got misery from how Paul taught her. One particular instance is on page 143, where she has her first day at school teaching. All I could do now was walk up to Blanche, stand before her desk, take from her hand her exercise book, remount the estrade, deliberately read the composition, which I found very stupid, and in the face of the whole school, tear the blotted page in two. One particular sentence I find interesting in that is the fact that she mentions that it was in front of the whole school, and I thought this almost suggests that Lucy was proud of her humiliation tactic. Lucy then takes this a step further. This quote's on the same page. I slightly pushed the door and found it ajar. In an instant, and with sharpness, I had turned on her. In another instant, she occupied the closet. The door was shut, and the key in my pocket. And this proves quite beneficial for Lucy in terms of classroom management, in particular for students who like the pressure of a firm heel. And now, in What is a Woman to Do, I chose the essay by Marianne Stoddart. Within the initial description of the essay, we are immediately drawn to this idea of separate spheres, that the expectations of women and those of men should not mix. Stoddart begins by addressing the effect of the classical studies on the mind. Classical studies are studies most conducive towards drawing out the faculties of the mind, but they afford the greatest variety of exercise, enlarge the domain of thought, give precision and exactness to knowledge, and open up stores of the most eminently useful information. We argue that in many cases it may really be a duty to give a young woman a classical education. So here, Stoddart highlights the importance of education for women, and more importantly, I feel, she highlights the effect that classical studies have, and for me, she's proving women's capability of such knowledge by demonstrating how it affects women. Another quote I found interesting was the following. A German critic once said of the character Hamlet that it was like an oak planted in a china vase, and such is genius in women. Firstly, the reference to Hamlet proves that she's well-read and is further evidence that women are capable. I found the use of figurative language quite interesting as well, and how it stresses the discordancy between separate spheres of womanhood, that of domesticity and genius. Furthermore, I think that Stoddart believes the fragility of the china reflects the way that men want women to be, so for instance, pretty, fragile and delicate, and void of intellectual abilities. The oak within presents the strong, unbreakable mind which women can attain, should they be permitted to access it. If women are to access the mind, then they must shatter the conventions and expectations that the china represents. Okay. And this is just a brief bibliography. Do you mind if I just grab my copy of the letter quickly?
Sure.
Thank you.
That was very interesting. I enjoyed that very much.
Thank
Do you know? Tell me about this. The Nelson. What was it? The Nelson Evening Post, 1884 Punch. Can we talk about that, please?
you. Yeah. Just get it up for you. Is that the poem, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a satirical poem, isn't it?
Yeah.
So this is something published in Nelson, Lancashire, and then republished in Punch, or what? What's the story of that?
I believe that they don't know who wrote it. I mean, I'm assuming it was a woman, based on the content of the poem. But it was published in the Nelson Evening Mail. I believe it was in response to the opening of new colleges for women, and this poem was basically highlighting.
Oxford and Cambridge colleges, or you mean all?
I'm not sure which colleges it was.
Or college in Nelson.
Oh,
You don't know.
I'm not sure. I didn't.
Okay. So what's it arguing? What's it saying?
I think it's basically saying why it's important for women to get a higher education and what they are capable of once they're given this education. Because I mean, it does address Newnham and Girton, which is obviously.
What does it say about the colleges?
With all the education gained at Newnham or at Girton, she'll puzzle men in algebra with horrible quadratics.
With horrible.
Quadratics.
Don't know what they are.
Is this
something
satirical? Right? It sounds very satirical.
I mean, is she lampooning the female scholar that they're unsexing themselves by studying, or is she patting you on the back?
I think she is unsexing them in a way.
Why do you think it's a she rather than a he?
I think I think, I'm not sure actually. I think I'm just assuming it's a woman because of how sceptical men were at this time of women gaining such an education.
But that's not a sceptical poem, in your opinion.
No, well, I think.
Can you read some more? And as I said, we seem to have a bit of time for the next person.
You take a maiden in to dine and find with consternation she scorns the light frivolities of modern conversation, and not for her the latest bit of fashionable chatter. Her pretty head is well nigh full of more important matter. You talk of drama or burlesque, the actual themes pursuing. She only thinks of what the dons at Oxford may be doing.
It does sound like a male's perspective. I expect this from my dinner mate, my female dinner mate, and this is what I'm going to get instead.
Yeah.
Rather anxiously.
It raises the kind of question, which I work a lot on 19th century satire. John Stratton, by the way, and the kind of question you have to address is the kind of tonal registers that are going on here. Can you read? This kind of. I also work in Irish studies, and there's a lot of people in Irish studies who go into Punch and they find the most kind of virulently anti-Irish jokes they can, and that is suddenly transposed to be the orthodox kind of the orthodox position of old British people, which of course is plainly by no means the case. It's much more nuanced.
Okay.
But I mean, what you've used Cruikshank and you use this, and I thought I really enjoyed the kind of interdisciplinary kind of looking at the text and these external things as well. But are there dangers in using comedy and satire to talk about the realities of life, or not?
I suppose because it's sort of taking a less serious approach to the subject. I mean, I think I just thought it'd be a different twist. I suppose I did really think about the fact that it perhaps was a bit more satirical than, obviously, than the actual facts themselves. Mm.
Because satire can be very profound. I mean, since the days of Virgil and Juvenal and so on, it's comedy with a moral purpose, and it's making moral points. And I think that's probably how I would defend the use of caricature, because it actually is saying things which are important, perhaps in a kind of more heightened kind of way.
Mm.
Yeah, that first line, the first two lines there, that's Crookshank exactly right, those first two lines.
Maybe by then. Sure. Yeah,
Maybe Crookshank wrote this.
maybe.
So the Crookshank Comic Almanac was when 1840.
1847.
Because he has a roster of really distinguished contributors to his annuals, Crookshank, Dickens and all of the founders of Punch and so on. And there's lots of really interesting things going on in those books. And then Crookshank's almost impossible to pin down, because he mocks the Tories on one side, then he attacks the Whigs. He kind of paid gun in some ways. And then in the last 20 years of his life, he's obsessed with temperance. He becomes this zealous anti-drinking kind of campaigner.
Okay, I think that's it. Okay.
Thank you very much.
What is that? I think that's it.